It wasn't long ago I finished up my playthrough of The Division 1, and honestly, I felt like that experience would be really hard to top. The atmosphere, the vibe, the feeling of exploring a basically post apocalyptic New York City, I felt like there was no way that Division 2 could top that. And well, I was right. But does that make The Division 2 a worse game? Well, no. I think The Division 2 is the better game overall. See, I've been on a bit of a Division binge lately. The urge crept up to play the first one, and it didn't disappoint at all. So much so that even after completing the story, I ended up spending a bunch of time in the endgame. That experience alone made me excited to play the Division 2. So that's exactly what I did. It's been 7 years since the game's release back in 2019. My god, I'm getting old. Since then, it's had multiple DLCs released and numerous updates that even to this very day it continues to receive. We can hate on Ubisoft for many things, but keeping their games fresh is something they clearly excel at. I went into the Division 2 expecting an improvement on just about every system that the first game established, and honestly it did just that. But there were some things that in my opinion the first game just does better. Now I don't want this video to turn into a comparison between the two games, but I'll definitely make references to the first title when trying to make some arguments more clear. So I guess let's just start with the world design. The Division 2 takes place in Washington, D.C., and it's a stark contrast to the first. Gone are the skyscrapers and snowy streets, and in comes the humid and overgrown ruins of a post-pandemic D.C. One thing about the first game that stood out to me was how lonely the experience felt at times. Outside of a few civilians coming up to me when they need something or finding small events dotted in the city, the world felt pretty empty, but in a good way, in the way that it should feel, as in humanity had been nearly wiped out due to some new pandemic. The Division 2 is different because it takes place months after the events of the new pandemic. A vaccine had already been developed, and America is in a slow rebuilding phase. That's the theme of the Division 2. Rebuilding. And to be honest, it plays into that theme very well. Washington isn't as lonely nor as abandoned as New York City. It's much more lively, and that can be a good thing. There are way more civilians walking around, patrolling in groups, or fighting off enemies. There's wildlife everywhere, deers, dogs, and so on. You can see how nature has slowly started reclaiming the land with greenery poking through roads and buildings. Honestly, it all just looks so good, and it feels good to roam around in. One of the main criticisms, and I guess where there's a ton of discourse between players, is mostly centered on how this change in atmosphere is a step back. That atmosphere that the first game built is completely non-existent in the sequel, and I can totally see why that would be something that would push players away who enjoyed the first title. Personally, I think the vibe of the first game is unmatched. There isn't an equivalent to roaming around New York City. However, I also think that the Division 2 does many things right. The various monuments and landmarks are fun to see in the game, and they all just look really good. The level design is up there with the Division 1, making each mission feel distinct from one another with highly detailed interiors that give each mission its own unique feeling. The American History Museum, Air and Space Museum, Lincoln Memorial, and Space HQ were all highlights to me. The devs, just like the first game, did a really good job in crafting these levels and packing them with detail. I also liked how dynamic the open world felt, civilians moving resources to nearby settlements, patrolling for groups of enemies, and scouting control points. Groups of enemies fighting with one another, enemy patrols looking for and transporting goods. All of those additions made going from mission to mission feel much more alive and engaging. It was extremely common for me to take out a few control points in between my travels to the next mission. Now, seizing these control points actually ends up affecting the density of enemies in that particular area. And honestly, it became one of my favorite activities to do on a whim. There are way more public events taking place that require your intervention, whether that be a group of enemies holding civilians hostage or blasting propaganda, among a few others. You'll never really travel too far without something popping up nearby. This loop is also perfect for casually leveling, not needing to solely rely on side missions to help you push past that next threshold. There are, of course, a number of new factions to deal with that range from your run-of-the-mill bad guys to a more advanced military outfit. Once you finish the game, the Black Tusk invade. This is a more advanced military group with legit weaponry, tech, and tactics, presenting a brand new challenge. While this setting lacks the original feel's isolation, the Division 2 definitely excels with its detailed mission environments, dynamic open world activities, and a living world that constantly pulls you into new encounters between story missions, and it's something that I ended up enjoying a lot more than I thought I would. The Division 2 is all about the loot, and thankfully there is plenty of it. One of my main issues with the first title was that the loot drops just weren't all that great throughout the main story. Truthfully, I felt the same about the Division 2 to start, but things did start picking up fairly quickly. I felt the progression was better, and I was getting a constant stream of upgrades coming in for all different pieces of my gear. I was a lot less reliant on the vendors and the crafting system in comparison to the first game, where those two things basically supplied 90% of my gear for my initial playthrough. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the Division games have a tiered loot system where the loot drops range from uncommon to exotic. The higher the rarity, the better the attributes associated with it, such as armor, crit chance, headshot damage, and so on. There are many attributes that can roll on a weapon. Once I hit around level 25 or so, the high-end drops started coming in and continued to rain down as I progressed through the endgame. What I liked about the gear system in this game is that basically every item you pick up can be part of a set. Now, there's some distinction here. There are what the game calls brand sets. These are items manufactured by a specific brand. Equipping 3 of a brand's gear provides some large passive boosts. This is a great way to get a starter build going, and you can really hone in on a specific playstyle. Are you the type of guy who sits in the back and picks people off from a distance, or do you rush enemies down with shotguns or SMGs, or something in between? There is a large variety to choose from, and you can mix and match to an extent. I loved this system, and I was pretty quickly up and running with a marksman build to start. As I gained more gear, my playstyle would shift. By the end of the game, I had settled on an SMG and sniper approach. I was constantly swapping gear for the next incremental upgrade, which is exactly how a looter should play. By the time I was deep in the endgame, I had started targeting the loot I was looking for. The Division has a great system in place for bettering the odds of certain items and sets, but I'll discuss that more in the endgame section of this video. That being said, I really enjoyed the gear progression in this game. Now, unsurprisingly, this game is all about shooting. I know how earth-shattering that must be for those unfamiliar, but here's the thing. The Division 2 plays almost exactly the same as the first game, except it's way easier and more fluid. I mentioned in my Division 1 video how a typical story playthrough of a looter video game is fairly easy. That wasn't the case at all in that game. I was getting absolutely clapped left and right. If I didn't go and grind my level up to the recommended one, or I didn't upgrade my gear somehow, I wasn't able to complete a mission. If you don't believe me, go and watch my 0 to Endgame video. In the Division 2, this is not the case at all. I found my initial playthrough very easy, and yes, it was only the first playthrough where every mission is done on the normal difficulty. I only mention this because it's a big difference between the two titles. I was comfortably completing missions with little issue even 2 levels below the recommended one in the Division 2 campaign. Of course, once you reach the endgame, you unlock the ability to play the whole story again on harder difficulties, and the game is absolutely no joke when you get there. You will die a lot if your build is not optimized. I also felt like I was able to freely fight out of cover for longer durations in this game. In the first one, if I stuck my body out for more than 2 seconds, I found all my armor shot off and I was near death. In this game, I was rolling around, pushing enemies hard, and played a far more free-flowing style, which I ended up preferring. I wasn't punished the same way I was in the first game for my aggression. Now, enemies in this game also behave differently from one another. We first have the hyenas, who really focus on attacking civilians and just being nuisances. They're not very organized and don't have any tactic to their combat. It's just pure chaos going up against them. The outcasts are a bit more organized and they wield different weaponry such as flamethrowers, RC cars with saw blades, which are particularly annoying, but they're overall more crafty in their approach. Then you have the True Sons. These guys are another paramilitary group in the same vein as the LMB from the first game. They have a ton of firepower and certain combat expertise that the other groups lack. There's also the Black Tusk, who you won't even encounter until you hit level 30. They are at the top of the food chain in terms of combat prowess, weaponry, and equipment. It's funny how once you hit the end game, these guys are literally everywhere. They've invaded every main mission. All the strongholds you've already completed once need to be redone, but this time is going to be up against the Black Tusk, presenting a fresh challenge in what is a familiar environment. One interesting addition that I enjoyed was how certain enemies need to be systematically eliminated. We saw a bit of this in the first Division, where you can hit a cleaner's gas tank to cause them to explode. The Division 2 really improves on this, making it so that when you encounter fully armored enemies, you'll need to shoot off a piece of armor in order to reveal a weak spot. Same with many other enemies who carry ammo packs, gas canisters, and so on. It's a nice touch that keeps gameplay fresh and encounters feeling unique. Progression in the Division 2 is broken up into 3 tiers. Well, Not really, but that's how I'm going to break it down anyway. To start, we have skills. Skills are basically your active abilities. There are 8 to choose from, and I think 3 more get added in the DLC. Each skill has 3 to 4 variations, usually changing the skill's behavior. These are all unlocked naturally as you play through the story, but the variants are unlocked using your shade tech points. I ended up running a turret and drone combo because as a solo player, that extra boost in damage and having the drone pull enemies off me was massive for my survivability. Some skills are obviously more geared towards group play. This is a great way to split the skills in my opinion. If I'm running with a squad, I have zero reason to run a drone or a turret. Outside of skill progression, there's also perk progression. These perks are not as impactful as the ones from the first game. They are passive bonuses, but the bonuses for the most part are kind of meh. Like extra material storage or gaining access to hard bounties, some would just be better off not included in this perk tree at all. Eventually, you do unlock all perks using the shade tech instead of having to choose 1 or 2 from each tree like the first game had you doing. Now we got to talk about something important, level scaling. The first game was brutal, but granted you unlimited freedom. You can venture off to a really high level area and find yourself getting killed with a single bullet. It was tough, but honestly, I love when video games do that because you can come back hours later and destroy everyone in that same once high level area. That's not the case in The Division 2. Instead, regions of the map are locked down until you reach certain parts of the main story. Naturally, you'd progress to a level that wouldn't be completely destroyed in those new areas. Going back to older areas from the beginning of the game will have enemies that are either exactly at your level or 1 or 2 below you. The game does have level scaling, meaning you can't go back to the starting area and demolish everything in a single bullet. To me, this is a double-edged sword. While level scaling does make it so that all areas and all content in the game are still relevant much later in the game, it takes away from that power fantasy of becoming unstoppable. In this particular game, it's really not that big of a deal. In fact, it didn't bother me much at all, but I figure I'd mention it anyway because there are some gamers out there who really, and I mean really, hate level scaling. The next tier of progression is what I'll call world progression. This is where you go around liberating control points, upgrading settlements, completing projects, and so on. Truthfully, a lot of this is just busy work, especially any upgrades to the settlements. They're largely pointless outside of just being fast travel hubs. The projects you complete for these settlements at least provide you with a bunch of XP. The last tier of progression would be your actual gear. This is pretty well done in The Division 2 as I explained earlier. There's a nice sense of improvement on a never-ending treadmill of better and better loot. Eventually, once you make it to level 40 in the end game, it's all about optimizing your build through different tinkering and refinement opportunities. There are 18 different gear sets, all of which cater to a specific playstyle. If you're trying to have the best gear in the game, you'll need to have one of those sets along with an exotic item or 2. The specialization really adds a nice layer of depth to the whole build crafting thing. Once you hit level 30, you unlock 6 different specializations, each with its own unique weapon that you'll need special ammo for. But each of these specializations also has its own skill tree, allowing for further build refinement. You can even unlock a new variant of a skill based on which one you're running. I went with the Demolitionist since I was running solo, and I was able to clear out large groups of enemies with a single fire of my grenade launcher. It was so satisfying. All in all, I like the progression of this game. The constant gear drops, unlocks, and big XP gains kept me moving along at a very steady pace. The end game. Where do I even begin? The Division 2 has a large and expansive endgame with a ton of activities to do, and if you're like me, you might get a bit overwhelmed with everything that becomes available because you want to try everything. I went into the game as a solo player and it stayed that way. I didn't really have any interest in doing group activities, so that's how I'm going to frame my analysis. Now, when you hit level 30, a group called the Black Tusk invades, taking over any stronghold you've already finished. Previously, each stronghold you complete in the endgame would move you up by 1 world tier, but that's all been removed. Now, instead of capping at level 30 and moving on to gear score, you instead can level up to 40. Gear score is completely gone. Honestly, that's something I liked about the Division 1. Seeing better and better gear come in with a higher score was a fun push, but I can see why they went that way. I had purchased the Warlords of New York expansion, so after I completed all the strongholds again, I made my way to New York. There, I was able to level up to 40, but if you don't own the expansion, then you would just level up to 40 naturally in DC by rerunning missions and strongholds. Once you hit level 40, you move on to Shade Tech levels. These are basically Paragon levels if you're familiar with those in Diablo. Essentially, a near infinite amount of attribute progression in different categories like damage, crit chance, armor, health, and so on. Each time you hit the level threshold, you unlock another point to use. I have no complaints about the system at all. I think it's a perfect way to keep grinding and grinding. The targeted loot system is great. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but basically each area of the overall map will have a specific gear set that has a higher chance of dropping from enemies and missions completed during that time. The targeted loot does change every day, but it's a good way to farm specific items you've been hunting for. So what exactly was fun about the end game? Well, I really enjoyed the summit activity. This is exactly the type of thing that resonates with me personally. A 100-floor skyscraper that asks you to go floor by floor, defeating enemies in different scenarios where every 10th floor results in a boss encounter. Throughout the experience, you gain a ton of XP, and each run of the 100 floors takes a really, and I mean really long time. But thankfully, there are checkpoints every 3 floors. You can bump up the difficulty of each run by adding directives. These are like mini challenges that augment the experience in some form or fashion. Aside from the summit, there is also the descent. This is a roguelike mode that makes it so that you cannot use any of your existing gear. Instead, you go through a series of rooms in some simulation environment, clearing enemies and gaining new buffs and passives. Honestly, I thought I was gonna like this mode much more than I did, but I ended up dropping it after like 2 runs. I don't know why, I just didn't find it fun at all. Now, of course, you can rerun missions, do bounties on harder and harder difficulty, but if you want the full Division 2 endgame experience, you'll need to group up. Now, I can't really speak to the quality of the content, but you do have 2 different 4-player raids that require you to know the mechanics before going in. There is also an incursion that is basically like a raid, and this is returning from the Division 1. Essentially, what the endgame boils down to is how much you're willing to challenge yourself. Like every looter, you want to test your build, see your progress, and continue to refine and tinker your gear until you hit another threshold. I really do think what this game offers in terms of things to do in the endgame is really well done. With the new survival mode dropping soon or having dropped by the time you see this video, there will be even more to do. I should mention that the Division 2 does have ongoing seasons. As you play, you level up your season rank and claim rewards as you move up the different tiers. You know how this works, so I won't go into detail about this. Overall, I was satisfied with the end game offerings. Now, believe it or not, the game has a story. I saved this section for last because according to the data I've gathered, the story section is often the one no one cares about. Does the game have a good story? Well, no, not really. It feels like it barely has a story and it's pretty incoherent. To me, it was weak, forgettable, and just paper thin. It's sad because it could have really built on the foundation that the first game laid down, but that's not the case at all. Most of the time you're running around doing missions for different settlements. Often these missions have very little to do with the overarching plot. Instead, they're tailored to a specific settlement's plot, which is largely non-existent. There aren't any memorable characters, there aren't any high stakes. Essentially, the story just feels like it was an afterthought. I won't dwell on this too much, however. Now, there are DLCs that continue Keener's story from the Division 1, in which you go back to New York and deal with 4 of Keener's warlords, and ending with the final battle against the man himself. The events seem like they set up the Division 3, but I could be wrong. Now, I really hope the dev team takes the narrative more serious in the next game. They've built a really strong world and there's a ton of lore to back it up. They just need to put it all together into a coherent story. What I liked about the Division 1 is that the story was at least there. We're pushing towards something important, trying to understand why and what happened. But the Division 2 is kind of just like running around and doing these disconnected plot points. Anyway, if you're coming into this game wanting to play it primarily for the story, I would highly suggest not coming in with big expectations. At the end of the day, the Division 2 didn't replace what made the first game special, and I honestly don't think it ever could. But what the game does is something different. It takes the foundation of the first game and refines it. The systems are tighter, the builds are deeper, the end game is broader. There's more to do, more ways to play, and more reasons to stick around.